All right, thank you very much for attending today's keynote talk from Todd Taylor for the IDEAL initiative. I'd like to start by thanking Carrie McKeever for making this all possible. The IDEAL initiative was her idea, and she was the one who wrote the grant founded by the Davis Foundation, so of course we want to thank the kind folks at Davis as well. I'd also like to thank the members of the IDEAL Steering Committee, Frank Cohen, Chris Previtt, Leslie Ingalls, Tom Tolbert, Kristen Nevius. And I'd also like to thank our technical folks who have helped us get everything set up today, Cheryl Blevins, Richard Morris, and Eric Salmonson. So just to get you up to speed, IDEAL stands for the Initiative for Digital Education for Accelerated Learning. And in May 2018, the university was granted funds from the Davis Foundation in order to transform current undergraduate pedagogical practice at Franklin Pierce through the enhancement across the curriculum of digital skills and literacy, usually referred to as DSL. Todd Taylor is with us today. Dr. Todd Taylor is the Eliason Distinguished Professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he also directs the first-year writing program. Since the early 1990s, his research and teaching have examined how literacy is evolving in response to rapidly changing digital, information, and network technologies. He's recently authored Adobe Creative Cloud Across the Curriculum, a guide for students and teachers, and Becoming a College Writer, a multimedia text. He's also co-edited Literacy Theory in the Age of the Internet. Today, Todd will talk to us about the potentials and possibilities for digital literacy in the classroom, and a nice little phrase he came up with is, it gives us an excuse to innovate. So with that, I will turn it over to Todd.
All right, wait for the selfie. I'm going to put that there. Thank you for having me. Last night was my first night ever in the state of New Hampshire, and it was lovely. I stayed in Keene. Thank you for having me. And so the subtitle, or the main title, is an invitation to innovation, and that sort of sums up my experience over 25 years, going back to graduate school, being an experimenter with instructional technology. And the theme from all of that work has been, since the very earliest days, to use powerful new technologies to enhance and leverage, or to use the words of your grant, to transform teaching and learning. And that is the mantra. That is a way to avoid the classic mistake of putting the horse in front of the cart when it comes to instructional technology, because these technologies are so, at least visually, captivating, and they're so sexy, and they're very expensive, and they get a lot of attention. And the classic mistake has been to focus on the technology and not the capabilities that the technology brings. And so that's the theme and the thesis of everything I've been saying for 25 years. And so I'm kind of this Johnny Appleseed of digital literacy, and I travel around to lots of different places, and everywhere I go, I'm focused on the same thing, which is helping faculty and IT leaders and instructional support staff figure out what's best for your campus and your programs and your classes and your courses. And I am categorically a pedagogy-first person. And so that's how I come at this. Everything I'll present today, you can find through this URL. You can follow that URL right now on your phone if you want. So there'll be a number of links and a couple of videos that you may want to come back to. There are going to be a lot of resources that I'm sharing toward the end of the presentation, and they're all linked from this place. When you click on that link, you will get to the portfolio of all the different presentations I've been giving lately, and obviously yours is right here. For those of you who might have to leave early, hopefully this won't be a spoiler alert. If you take anything away from what I say today, it would be to use this incredible new technology called Adobe Spark, specifically Adobe Spark Page, which is free. It's cloud-based. You could go walk into your class 30 minutes from now, and you're going to be in a class in 12:15, and you could say, you know what, instead of that research paper that's on the syllabus, you have the option of, instead of producing it in Microsoft Word, producing it in an Adobe Spark page. Go to adobespark.com, sign up for your free license, and then just see how transformative making a research paper in this format can be. What's so exciting about this new generation of application and capability is the learning curve is becoming flatter and flatter and flatter, to the point that you don't even need to spend 1 minute of class time teaching students how to use this application. You can tell them just to go to that website and figure it out themselves, and then see what happens. And so, I don't know that that's a spoiler alert, but at least you can leave here with one thing today that can make a difference in your classroom, not just tomorrow, but in the next 15 minutes. Paul just read from the grant, the IDEAL grant, and I excerpted this piece from it. The goal of the IDEAL is to transform current undergraduate pedagogical practice at this university through enhancement across the curriculum of digital skills and literacy. And I want to insist that we focus on that. The whole reason to do this is to transform teaching and learning, to do a better job of what we've all been trying to do since Isocrates' time, of creating critical readers and thinkers, of doing what we know works, but just doing it better and in more engaged ways. The goal is not ever to learn a piece of software. When people started using the term digital literacy in the late 1990s, it was, okay, undergraduates now need a class in Microsoft Excel, they need a class in Microsoft Word, they need to learn HTML, and those are valuable skills. But to me, those are not skills that will last. It's kind of like fast food knowledge. What you want to do, and the theme of everything I have to say, is you want to look at your learning outcomes. You want to look at your pedagogical principles. You want to look at what your university and your classes are supposed to be about, and you want to use that as an excuse to innovate using these powerful technologies. The goal is never to learn a piece of software. The goal is to, as we said here, transform teaching and learning. So the context we're in, we're all pretty familiar with. We're somewhere in between the third or fourth industrial revolution, if you're keeping score. I'm not exactly sure how you want to name these things. If the first industrial revolution was the steam engine and the second one was mass production, the third one is obviously the information age, the digital and the internet age. And this is the context in which we're all operating. Just last February, the New York Times had a piece called Welcome to the Post-Text Future. There's some problem with tense there, but we'll let that go. When the New York Times is saying it's game over about textuality, that's a pretty significant moment as one of the greatest institutions of textual ideas in communication. What are they saying? What are they identifying? And here's an excerpt from this piece that you can link when you're going to go back to this. I'll make this short. The thing you're doing now, reading prose on a screen, is going out of fashion. The defining narrative of our online moment concerns the decline of text and the exploding reach and power of audio and video. Now, I'm a humanist. My PhD's in rhetoric. I'm not ever going to abandon writing or textuality. I direct the one required course at my university, the first-year writing course. So I don't believe text is going away. I just think it's being transformed. And part of the way it's being transformed is through communication and ideas that are being developed in this new post-industrial context and landscape. So what does this mean for higher education? In this moment of lots of change in our world, there is a re-examination and a re-articulation of the value and the role of higher education that we're all very familiar with. The result of that is whenever I give a talk, I say to the audience, and oftentimes it's a mixed audience of people from 50 to 100 different campuses, I say, raise your hand if your campus is not re-examining or reimagining its general educational requirements right now or recently. And no one ever raises their hand. Everyone is doing this right now for these obvious reasons, because this is the context in which we're operating. And like the IDEAL initiative, the result is that our strategic plans, our mission statements, our assessment programs, our metrics, our QEP, are all pointing to a different and more sincere approach to teaching and learning. That is that keyword, transformative. It's focusing on student experiences. It's talking about preparing students for global and professional futures and transforming their communities. Additionally, in this context, we are in a new digital renaissance. And I love this, this image, the sketch from Da Vinci, where the human form is beautiful and organic and very humane, but it's also being analyzed and broken down mathematically and geometrically. And to me, that's what defined that renaissance, and that defines, I think, what's most powerful and exciting about this particular renaissance. It's this unique marriage between technology and art, between science and humanity. And when our classes and our students are a part of that transformation, a part of that moment of renaissance, where they're thinking both digitally and organically, I think that's when really special and powerful things happen. And so I look at it as my job as a curricular leader and as a faculty member to harness the potential of this particular moment, to bring the best of all of these worlds together. On my campus right now, as on many large campuses, there's a trend to create something called maker spaces. And I understand that you don't have the one here. And if you haven't heard of them, what they are is people are looking at the traditional liberal arts curriculum the way maybe it used to be taught, and on a campus like mine where there's no engineering, they say these students aren't making anything, they're not producing anything, they're not entrepreneurial, they're not exploring, they're not doing anything with their hands. It lacks a tactile experience. And so they're creating these maker spaces that have sewing machines and welding and woodworking for students to innovate and to be entrepreneurial, often about starting businesses as undergraduates that obviously are intended to continue to the profession. But what's behind this is the same trend that's with the re-examination of higher education, and that is a commitment to high-impact, transformative, experiential teaching and learning, where people are making things, they're problem-solving, they're doing something, they're creating something, and they're not just passive consumers of ideas and knowledge, right? And so students are no longer passive, they become active producers, they learn by doing and by making, and the idea is to focus the learning outcomes on capacities, I like that word better than skill, on capacities that will transfer, not just from the first year to graduation, but from graduation throughout their whole life as lifelong learners. Now, maker spaces, as you can imagine, are really, really expensive. Not to mention life cycling them, maintaining them, having to keep them going. And so what we've done at UNC Chapel Hill is we've created what I would call a virtual makerspace through a partnership with Adobe software. Adobe makes something called Creative Cloud, which is a suite of industry standard software applications for creativity, including a video editor, obviously Photoshop, all these different things. And the idea is not to learn a piece of software. The idea is to have our students participate in a virtual makerspace where their intellectual work is meant to circulate, where they're given assignments that ask them to critically and creatively solve problems for themselves, their communities, their professions, in the context of their classrooms. And this is perfectly consistent with the mission and the vision statement of your university right now. And so I highlighted some of the ideas that I've already been talking about in your mission statement, the integration of liberal arts and professional programs, like the Renaissance that I just talked about, with a focus on experiential and applied learning to develop leaders of conscience. And it's interesting to me, someone who started studying ancient Greek rhetoric in graduate school, that if you read what Isocrates had in mind for his first ideas of higher education, it was exactly what we're doing now, which is to educate a new generation of citizen scholar who does exactly these things. They're leaders of conscience. They're ethical leaders who become catalysts for positive change. Your vision statement wants this campus to become a distinctive educational institution. And it wants your alumni to be well prepared for the professional, personal, and social demands of the 21st century. Those all sound like no-brainers. But delivering it is something else. How are you going to do these very big and difficult and transformative things? And it's my idea that just because you add something like Adobe Creative Cloud doesn't mean this is automatically going to happen. It's the occasion of getting people around a table and the synergy that happens as a result of that. Thinking about the kinds of changes you want to make that becomes this catalyst or this invitation for change. And so I'm going to describe what we've done at UNC Chapel Hill In the year 2000, we had a progressive chancellor, we had a progressive CIO, and required every student to have a laptop beginning in the year 2000, which was unheard of at the time for a large public institution. And at that time, because they were trying to make something happen that was bold and different, there were lots of resources and lots of money being channeled to the innovation that I was hired to do when I joined the faculty in 1997. Since then, we all know what happened in 2008, 9, and 10. Budgets keep getting cut. Software that I used to have was being taken away from me. And whenever I asked for anything, the answer was no. And so as a state employee, I was pretty demoralized until all of a sudden, I got a call from our CIO in February of 2016 who said, hey, we're thinking about adopting a license between the university that will provide Adobe Creative Cloud to all of our students. And this is a very different model. There's lots of campuses who provide Adobe Creative Cloud for faculty and staff. Very few of them flip that model and say, who really needs this software more than anyone? It's our students. And so this was just wild to get a call from the CIO. At first I thought I'd broken something or I downloaded something and I was in trouble. But he had the vision and the innovation to put together this partnership, and he called me up and he said, do you have any ideas? I said, I've got 20 years of ideas. I've just been waiting for the moment that I could do this because I knew that I wanted to integrate multimodal writing into my first year writing program for all students the moment they came to campus. But I didn't have the software. They had the laptops, but they didn't have the software to do this kind of thing until I got this call. And so here's a quick video that kind of summarizes the initiative I'm going to say.
The University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill is the first public university in the United States, and so of course we take that with a great sense of pride.
There's a sense in which students who arrive here appreciate that they have a special opportunity.
The partnership between UNC and Adobe Creative Cloud has provided licenses for every single student. It's only natural that you want to take the most powerful collection of digital literacy tools and make them accessible to your students because this is how knowledge is made. The students find it extremely engaging to use Adobe Creative Cloud to get their work done in any class, anywhere across the curriculum. So nursing, business, public health, even physics, chemistry, religious studies, and anthropology are using these tools not to learn how they work, but to help support teaching and learning.
Everyone having access to this also means that you can learn from one another, which I think is going to be the best training tool and adoption tool as this continues to grow in the next couple of years.
The engagement when students are working on digital projects goes way up, and I think that's linked to internal motivation as opposed to being motivated for a grade. What was really great about watching my students do this video poetry assignment was the students started to better understand their poems. It can happen in traditional ways, but the technology kind of makes really unexpected things jump out.
I define digital literacy as critical digital literacy, which means it's not just the ability to use digital and information tools, it's the ability to think critically and to get critical work done with them.
If I can use digital tools to move students to be active producers of knowledge rather than passive consumers, then I think it's really valuable.
Students are really excited by the opportunity to really engage their work, and not just produce work that's going to end up on the shelf and no one else is going to see. These are communication tools, and they inherently want students to take their deeply intellectual work and circulate it. At the end of every application right now, there's a share button, and that's not accidental, that's powerful.
This has truly been a partnership. We have seen investments on both sides of the equation. I'm pleased because Adobe certainly has invested in the University of North Carolina. Here in Chapel Hill, we're happy that Adobe can help us better provide these capabilities to our faculty and students, which they've done.
All of these sorts of problem-solving approaches are really what's going to make you a valuable employee as you move forward.
It's going to tell a story about who they are as a person, what they're doing, and what they want to do that will set them apart from other students in the same industry that are at universities that don't have access to this.
There's clearly no limit to this. My students see that and their eyes light up.
And so I want to be very clear that the real benefit of our partnership with Adobe isn't Adobe. It's the occasion to get together, and you don't necessarily have to do the same thing. It's just worked very well for us. And so our recipe has been to focus on the first year experience, specifically the first year writing course that's required of every student. Nobody gets out of it. There's no AP, there's no placement, there's no dual credit. Everyone at university takes that one course, and we intentionally leverage that course as a threshold experience because it's already an interdisciplinary course. In our first year writing program, students write 1 unit on the humanities, 1 unit on the social sciences, and 1 unit on the sciences, which is meant to prepare them to do intellectual and inquiry work no matter what they major in, no matter what the class might be. And the thought was that if we can introduce this digital literacy concept of experiential transformative learning there, then you'll get a maximum impact by having them want to do their work this way throughout their undergraduate career. There are some people who've sort of experimented with this kind of digital literacy program nationwide who have waited to the junior or senior year until they're in a major or they're in a specialized course. But what everyone has reported back is that's too late. If we really are trying to transform teaching and learning and deliver on the learning outcomes to prepare students for the 21st century, you want to hit them the moment they come to campus. So how can we imagine a very, very important course with a lot of agenda already, such as a first year writing course, to be an introduction to this kind of literacy without undermining the other things we need to accomplish? And so much of my work is about flattening the learning curve and making the on-ramp to these kinds of literacies in terms of teaching and learning manageable. Here are all the different departments at UNC that as a result of this initiative, which is essentially like your IDEAL initiative as well, are using Creative Cloud to transform their teaching and learning. And we know they're using it to transform their teaching and learning because faculty didn't get a license for free. They had to apply. They had to apply and give a pedagogical justification for the way they were going to use this resource in their classrooms. And so we know professors from each of these departments all across campus are doing this in different and transformative ways, so it's not just in first year writing. Who recognizes this icon? Anybody know what this represents? What is it? Photoshop. And so for those of you who don't know, you've heard the word Photoshop, and some people are surprised that it's actually a brand name. Some people think that's just what you do to photographs. But it's actually an Adobe brand name, and it's, of course, their most famous application. And so that's Photoshop, which is part of Creative Cloud. Anyone recognize this icon? Adobe Illustrator, which is, if you have any packaging, it was probably created in Illustrator. And so anybody recognize this icon? None of you should be able to recognize it since I made it up. And it's not what your dirty mind thinks. SX stands for student experience. And to me, this is the icon, this is the brand that I have plastered up above my desk that I look at every day when I think about what I do. The whole reason, the whole justification for this is to transform the student experience. This is a very expensive thing to do if you're going to just keep doing business the same way you always have. It needs to be this occasion to innovate, right? And so this is the beginning and the end of why we want to do everything. It's not to learn a piece of software. It's not to look sexy. It's to really make a difference in our students' experiences, right? And so we've talked a lot about these ideals to the point that I think it's almost a no-brainer. The things that are in your QEPs and strategic plans and mission statements and vision statements, they're the same that are in ours. It's a national, if not international trend. The question is, how do you deliver on that? How do you really make it happen? And what does it look like when this does happen? I'm going to share with you the last 2 minutes of a 10-minute video called Our Lives Together by an undergraduate. Her name is Carrie Lewis. And she had never made a film before in her life. She took a class of mine, and it's the story of an elderly couple with a father, and the patriarch of the family is suffering from advanced Alzheimer's. And the story is told from the perspective of the loving mother and son. And as you're watching this, it's so remarkable to me to think that this student had never used a video editor before, never made a film before, and was able to do such sophisticated and advanced, sensible things in her first try. And so, as you're watching this, keep in mind this is the first video she's ever made, Our Lives Together by Carrie Lewis.
herself her whole life. And so she continues to live that out right now. I think it's been difficult, not only having to make decisions that she's not used to making, but also just to go through the pain of him not recognizing people and just deteriorating physically, and the frustration of, say, asking the same questions over and over every 5 minutes because he doesn't remember that he asked them already. Those kinds of things, are hard and they're frustrating, but she's incredibly patient and incredibly kind, incredibly loving, and just continues to work through it.
As long as there's breath, there is a plan. And I think there's an untold joy in fitting into that plan. When all is said and done, that's really the point. What pleases the Lord? I mean, what fulfills what He created us to be and to do. Even if it were that you never touched the real person, which I don't believe that, but if it were, I think I would still feel the same way, because this is the man that I have lived with and honored and cared for. This is the commitment. This is marriage. This is our lives together.
And so compare the student experience of making this with your typical research paper on Alzheimer's. This student is never going to forget this project. And neither am I. And so another question is, in what kind of class does this belong? And this was assigned in a communications class. But if you think about it for a moment, it would belong in a class on psychology, on sociology, on mental health, on just about everything. And if you think larger about just the genre of the audio-visual research film, there isn't a class where this doesn't connect and doesn't belong. And so this, to me, is why I do what I do as a faculty member. Ever since I've been in graduate school, I've always been trying to have students see that the work they're doing in their class matters, that there's a purpose for it beyond just the four walls of our classroom, that it's meant to connect and it's meant to translate. And so when we think about the students we're educating, and here's a picture of some of your graduates, here's the promise that you make in your vision statement. This university's alumni will be well prepared for the professional, personal, and social demands of the 21st century. And so if you ask your students the difference between producing a typical research paper on Alzheimer's and doing something like that, what do you think they would say in terms of the level of engagement? Now, this doesn't mean that research papers have no place. They're still important. They still need to be done. But there's something else, and there are other possibilities. And to me, this is an example of why we want to innovate and experiment in these ways. And so what I have in mind is I want my students to be omniliterate, not just have only sort of singular or traditional versions of literacy. This is a portfolio of a student in my class. This was an introduction to digital storytelling class. And what she did was, what everyone in the class did is they researched a particular story that was interesting to them. And in this student's case, her parents were both in real estate, and she lived in this small little town called Hillsborough, North Carolina. And she wanted to promote tourism in this small little town. One of the interesting features of this town is it had one of the first NASCAR tracks ever. Now, it's not currently used as a NASCAR track anymore. It's just a dirt oval. And if you've ever been to North Carolina, NASCAR is very, very important to North Carolina, right? And so she wanted to promote this tourist aspect of her town, and that's where all of these projects begin with. They begin with stories that students want to tell. And I look at it as a faculty member as my responsibility to help them tell those stories. And so what they did is everyone in the class began by interviewing people on film and of course created a documentary film about the project called A Track Through Time. After that, she used Photoshop to create a photographic gallery of the work. And then she used Adobe Audition to create a podcast version of the work. And then used Adobe Muse to create a website version of it. And then Adobe InDesign to create a magazine layout. Same story, 7 different modes. And then finally, the last version of the story was, oh, this mouse is misbehaving. There we go. The last version of the story was to create a mobile app that interacts with GIS technology so that when you physically go to the speedway and you walk around, GIS technology says, over here on this bank in 1972, Richard Petty flew off and landed in the Eno River. And then over here behind the stands, they used to sell moonshine during the races. And so what you have here is an omni-literate person who tells the same story in 6 or 7 different modes. And what's also particularly interesting about this is that it was meant to be a portfolio all along. She was collecting and developing her own work, knowing that she was going to use this to apply for internships, which she did. In fact, Adobe wanted to offer an internship, but they didn't move fast enough. And the National Geographic Foundation offered her an internship. She spent her summer in New York City. Now this, to me, is the exact kind of student we want to develop. She's a double major in creative writing and geography. She spends her time writing stories and in a research lab with GIS GPS technology, and she was able to bring those things together to promote tourism in a rural town. And she has the ability to tell these stories in all these different modes now, which is incredibly powerful. And so in terms of thinking about preparing students for the 21st century, I don't care if you own a cupcake store. You need to be literate in these ways. Even if you hire other professionals to develop this material for you, for your brand and for your industry and for your job, you still need to understand how they work. And the best way to understand how they work is to get your hands dirty making stuff with these technologies themselves. And so I'm going to digress into a professorial moment for just a minute and think about defining or redefining tool versus instrument. When we talk about digital literacy, lots of people talk about we want students to have these tools. And to me, a tool or a skill is a little bit limited. I'm more interested in something much more comprehensive. And so if you think of a hammer is almost just a pure mechanical tool. It's almost an extension of your arm. It just makes your fist a little bit harder and more powerful. But an instrument helps you see the world differently. So compare a hammer to an electron microscope or the Hubble telescope. Those are instruments. They're epistemological. When you look through them, the world is transformed in different ways. And to me, that's the way to use instructional technology, as an instrument, to see the world epistemologically differently. And so if the goal of IDEA is to transform current undergraduate pedagogical practice, to me, I think that's the way you want to frame it. Think about these moments, these invitations to innovation as epistemological. And so I'm not just interested in digital literacy, the ability to use electronic tools. I'm interested in critical digital literacy. And the way I differentiate that is the difference between knowledge consumption and knowledge production, the difference between media consumption and information consumption and media production. And so digital literacy pedagogy becomes not just aesthetic. It's not just putting a sexy cover on the research you did at the end of the process. It imbues the process from the beginning. It's not just surface, it's substance. And so, I'll give you some examples about how this works. The idea is that this kind of deeply engaged teaching and learning promotes success for our students as lifelong learners. Here's a quote. This is like the professor's daydream. This is like I get the email from a student 15 years later who writes this, and I just love reading this because it makes me feel good, like I'm actually making a difference. I thought of you because I'm now in charge of my division's blog. I just utilized some HTML code that you taught me during my freshman year, which was 2000. When I reflect back on how I used the skills that you taught in that class, I'm amazed by what a positive impact you've had on my life. By using multimedia, you helped me understand the importance of strong communication skills, as well as giving me unique skills that others in my profession do not have. Okay, so this is like psychoanalysis, word is almost free association. When you hear this, what first comes to your mind in terms of what you think this person does? Don't overthink this. Somebody raise your hand. What do you think this person does? Marketing. Huh? Programmer. Anybody else? Did anyone have a mental image of this person? What do they look like? Raise your hand, be honest. How many of you imagined a male as a female? No one's gonna admit that. All right, here she is, assistant professor of emergency medicine, Emory University Medical School. All right, and I love to show this example of how even a profession like medicine is being transformed these days by these kinds of technologies that are happening in the digital space, right? And this medical school professor can do things that no one else in her curriculum can do because of her introduction to this so many years ago. So, no brainer. We all agree that this is what we want to do. The elephant in the room is flattening the learning curve. And we've known this since the late 90s, that faculty are the sort of limiting reagent. That in order for this to really take hold, faculty need the support and need the help and they need development to reimagine their teaching and learning. And that's what I'm here to do. To point to some successes, point you in some directions, get you started on a group of you on a workshop later this afternoon. The good news is the learning curve is flatter than ever. And that software that I showed you at the very beginning, Spark, is so simple that it really has reduced the learning curve to almost nothing. And so what you have now is a new generation of applications that is so much easier to use than before. It's unbelievable, right? Of course, the students are increasingly digital native. We now have a generation of instructional IT support staff who have partnered with faculty, who have experience helping faculty figure this out, so don't go alone. And then we have the new generation of faculty out here that kind of grew up in this millennial world and are a little bit more eager and regular and prepared to innovate. And so come on in. The water's never been better, and it's going to keep getting better. This is very doable. And so the story on my campus was we put together a proposal, not unlike your ideal proposal, for this digital literacy initiative and this partnership with Adobe. And the chancellor of the university, the provost, and the dean all came to the English department for the first time in the 21 years I've been there. Never seen them all together in one room, ever, except for commencement. And they came and they were making a tour of all the departments. This was in preparation for a big capital campaign, and they were asking us to report on the innovations we were developing because they wanted to take this and run it up the flagpole to generate money for a capital campaign. And so I had exactly 65 seconds to stand up and talk about the digital literacy initiative in the first year writing program. We talked about scaling it up carefully and slowly. In the first year, we were going to take 10 sections in one semester and 10 out of 120 sections in the second semester. And then the next year, we doubled that. And then in the third year, we were going to do full implementation and require every single section of first year writing to have at least one of 3 unit projects that would be a digital literacy assignment. And the chancellor literally interrupted me at that point and said, did I hear you right? Did you say you were going to take 3 years to do full implementation? I said, yes. She goes, I don't want you to do that. I want you to do full implementation immediately and not wait. And that night I did not sleep because that was November. And that meant by the next fall, I had to prepare 105 instructors in my writing program to be able to do this in these very deeply, powerful and different kinds of ways. And so my mission in life since that one mandate was to provide the materials and the support and the resources so faculty could get up to speed, so they could do this, right? And so I went to work immediately on creating a textbook called Adobe Creative Cloud Across the Curriculum, and there are links to it. It's available online for free. Everyone in the entire world could use it. And it's designed for students and teachers, as the title says, because most of the material out there in the world that's a tutorial for this kind of software is meant for creative professionals, for people who video edit for a living. How can you reduce this? How can you flatten the learning curve to give people just the bare necessities, just the things they need to know how to do in order to create the kind of film that that student did? Remember, that student had never edited a film before in her life and had this innate sensibilities, and a good teacher, I must admit, to go from zero to that creative in just 5 weeks, right? Now, obviously, that's the best example I've ever seen, but it still shows you what's possible. And so the idea is that I have a textbook now, and it's consistent with this theme of what is it you want to create? What kind of knowledge, what kind of critical thinking, what kind of critical reading and research and inquiry are you beginning with? It starts with asking, what kind of problem do you need to solve? It doesn't start with what kind of software do you want to learn how to use. It doesn't begin with how do you want to learn how to make a video. In fact, I have found after years of assigning this kind of service learning documentary film that students become much better filmmakers if they care about their subject than if we spent the whole time just teaching them how the technology works. So that student spent hours and hours and hours editing that video because she cared so much about what she was saying. I've actually had a couple people go on to be industry professionals, and you can identify them. The first week of class, they just stopped going to chemistry, they stopped going to all their other classes, and they spend all day video editing. But everyone isn't going to be that fanatical, but everyone can benefit by having some orientation to this. So notice that the textbook begins with that intellectual step. What is it you want to create? Then it goes into this sort of more practical chapter of how do the different applications work. And let's say you decided that you want to explore the possibilities of students creating their own magazine. The chapters are organized according to photographs, print, film, sound, websites, presentations, and portfolios. But let's say that you wanted to, in your science class, have students put together a scientific journal as opposed to just a sort of conventional research paper. This walks you step through step the considerations you need to make when making a print document for the first time. And what's most valuable to most faculty is that each one of these chapters concludes with a turnkey teaching module based upon some of the best things that my faculty have done, such as this one called Writing in the Sciences, Popular Science magazine using Adobe InDesign. So I'll give you a sense of what this looks like. So this is a first-year writing class. These are students who've just come to campus. This is from fall 2016. And this was put together using something called Adobe InDesign, which is desktop publishing software. And so even though this will probably never be printed out on paper, it looks just like a print magazine, right? It's called, I should emphasize the title, it's called Scientific Tar Heel instead of Scientific American. And in this, students did the conventional thing they often do in first year writing. They look at scholarly resources, they look at peer-reviewed articles about a scientific issue that's important to them. And then they synthesize or summarize those articles and what they find there for a lay audience. And think about the critical reading and writing skills that happen when you have to go from peer-reviewed scholarly scientific work to writing to a lay audience. There's a lot of thought that has to go into that. There's a lot of rhetorical strategy that has to go into that. And the goal here was never to learn a piece of software. The goal was to understand and think about how science works, how scientific communication works. And so I like to share this example along with my med school student to show you that this is as relevant to the sciences as it is to the humanities. It's as relevant to a class on organic chemistry as it is on digital storytelling. And so what we have then at the end of each of these chapters is a collection of turnkey modules using different applications with Adobe. And again, you don't have to use Adobe. You can go to these turnkey modules and you could use some other piece of software or whatever is available to you. And so when you go to the module, it's actually stored in a database that's free and accessible. You do have to, give them an email address, but you don't have to have a subscription to Adobe. And then There are about 24 of these modules, and they're going to be probably twice as many within 6 months. And so what we're doing is we're finding the best work, the most inspirational work, and we're having the instructors package it in such a way that anyone would come there, they can read a description of the assignment, and then down here are 5 things. The first thing is a video from the instructor herself, Tiffany, talking about what she did with the
My name is
assignment.
Tiffany Friedman, and in my fall 2016 first year writing class, my students and I used InDesign to create a scientific magazine in the style of Scientific American.
And so just 3 minutes into listening to the instructor describe the assignment, you get it. You go, oh, I see how this makes sense. I can see how this works. Now that I've seen the description, can you give me all your materials to make this easy for me to get up and run? And so we have here a link to a tutorial that's appropriate for beginners that teaches students just the basics of what they need to know in the software to get this project done. Obviously, there's a sample student work, such as what I just showed you. And then in Microsoft Word format, we put together the lesson plans so you can download those and you can edit them and change them and make them your own. And then, of course, we have the assignment prompt and the grading rubric. And so we have 24 of these modules of the best applications of this kind of teaching and learning, and they're all packaged in this way so that anyone can pick them up and run with them. And so it's been my sort of responsibility to help my faculty develop a digital pedagogy library. And I was reading your grant proposal for the IDEAL, and that's one of the deliverables, is to start collecting these things. And so as I go around the country, I'm trying to get more people to contribute to this database to collect these things so that we can all share them. There is, of course, the free online textbook that I talked about. There's a link to the turnkey modules. There is a link to my portfolio there. And if this worked correctly, big reveal, let's see if it worked correctly. I think it's going to work. So increasingly, all of this is able to be done on these devices. In fact, what you've just been looking at is called Adobe Spark Page, and I'll be leading a workshop on it in a couple hours. And I can do everything that I actually put together on this laptop through this phone. And so while you were sitting here, I took a picture of you. I have Adobe Spark Page on this phone. I clicked a button, and it uploaded on the fly and replaced the original image that I had at the beginning. And so this is where we know our students are living. And we want to, if for no other reason, we want to take control of this as a deeply intellectual space and not let it degenerate into Twitter. We want our students to think of these as knowledge-making tools and not empty-headed distractions. I want to co-opt this. I want to own this I want to own part of this space for my students instead of them doing things that don't promote critical digital literacy. And so that's just a taste of what I've been up to for 25 years, or at least the last 18 months. I hope to have some conversation now about what we're up to and how I can help you become better at this. I'll be doing a workshop later today. I don't know how many people can be invited or can participate in that. I'll take your thoughts and questions. And I have reams of things I can show you.
I've got a handheld mic here. If you have a question, please raise your hand so we can capture the question for the recording. So questions for Todd?
It appears to me that high school students were doing some of this stuff 10 years ago. Do you find that students coming into your programs have a lot of experience that your faculty do not have?
Yes. And you know, I don't like the sort of veiled threat that that reality may create. You know, I like to sort of present that as, you know, our students are coming with new abilities that we can really leverage, and not through some kind of intimidation that they expect to be entertained this way. But I'll tell you what, if you take the advice that I gave a minute ago and you just try having an interactive research paper instead of Microsoft, and you compare the two and you ask your students to compare the two, then I think that justifies the experiment. And then I think you can quickly move beyond the sort of threat of like, well, you better do this because your students are ahead of you. I don't like that kind of construct. So I think they are ready to go, but they're not universally ready to go. Technology is as powerful as it can be. We need to be constantly critical of it, because not just literal material financial access to it, but ideological and sometimes physical access to this is unequal. And so when we bring it into our classrooms, we shouldn't assume that everyone's way ahead of the game, because there will be people who are not. To me, that becomes one of the biggest motivations to do that, because as an institution, we tend to be much more egalitarian, I think, than most. And that there are going to be students who are going to be behind, who are being left behind in the digital divide. And if we can figure out a way within our egalitarian framework to give exposure and access to everyone, I think that's potentially a powerful thing.
Other questions?
Hi. You had said that the faculty had been trained in the first year writing courses. Do you find that there are other faculty outside of that has adopted the technology?
What was that, the last part?
Other faculty outside of the writing classes have adopted the technology and people are using it?
Oh yeah, people are using it all over the place and without any direct connection with me. So it's widely promoted. It tends to follow along the lines of young faculty members who have something to prove, or they're trying to work their way up or tenure or something, and they want to distinguish themselves. I mean, I thought it was interesting that part of your vision mission statement for the university was that you want to have a distinctive education experience. And to me, that's one of the reasons to do this, is a lever for change, an opportunity to make change. And so there are lots of people who are experimenting with this. There was a whole list of other departments that I had very little to do with that are part of the digital literacy initiative.
At one point early on, and I think it was in reference to the early video that the student did, you said that all projects begin with stories students want to tell. And frankly, that bothers me a little bit, because students often want opportunities, expressive opportunities, that are not necessarily informed. Later, though, in making reference to the online book, you said that the first point in getting started is, what problem do I need to help solve? And that's really where I would like to direct students. And I'm wondering how you use this technology to bridge that gap between opportunities for expression, which this very obviously provides, and students are eager to engage, and opportunities for learning, which requires more guidance, intervention, assistance, whatever. How do you get from one to the other?
Yeah. So in my area of composition rhetoric, we obviously think a lot about writing pedagogy. And one of the sort of persistent conversations is, what mode is most appropriate? And there is an argument that the narrative mode is separate than the expository mode, and there's some people who set up entire curriculums to say, well, we don't actually want students involved in the narrative mode, the expressive mode. We want them to be in an academic setting focusing on the expository mode, research, inquiry. So there are people who make strong distinctions between the two modes, and I tend to agree. When I'm talking quickly, the word digital storytelling is kind of a phrase that has a lot of currency at the moment. And so when I use that phrase, I'm not necessarily talking about the narrative mode. I'm not necessarily talking about the expressive mode. I'm talking about any idea. I mean, you could call it a digital, instead of calling it a digital narrative, you could call it a digital essay. And so is that more inquiry-based or expository in terms of what you're getting at? I particularly don't have in mind, when I say the word digital story, expression. I don't particularly have in mind creative writing or creative nonfiction, although creativity is a big important part of it. I actually have in mind evidence-based reasoning and presentation. And so I think there's a spectrum there, and I think people can and have drawn different definitions. What I have in mind is evidence-based, and evidence-based communication. And right now, the word digital storytelling, I don't distinguish in that way. So the question is there a way that I make the distinction between the modes clear to my students? And it's through the examples we give in class. And it's through, every day when people are bringing in drafts. And they're putting their drafts up, and we're talking about what works and what doesn't. And the rubric defines what we're expecting and what we're not. And so, my work on the spectrum from, let's say, expository to expressive is closer to expository. But it's not like a news feature where, there are some where students interview experts, and it is very much like a news segment. But there are others like the one we just saw where you have no sense of the student's own narrative voice at all. I think the way that I define the expectation is, first of all, through the rubric, but mostly through what we say every day in class when we're giving feedback to the work under development.
So I'm just kind of thinking about this in my head, looking at these examples, and are these typically, I'm just wondering, about how much time do the students typically take to do these? Is it normally like a capstone, end of the semester, here's my final presentation, or are they doing multiple of these videos and magazines throughout the semester? I'm just trying to think about how it's implemented across a semester.
It depends on the class, how complicated the requirements for the assignment are. In the class for the Alzheimer's and the Speedway story, it was the same digital story told 6/7 different ways. So that meant every other week they were recasting the story. And actually the first month was just gathering all the information, doing the background research, putting together an annotated bibliography, everything they needed to know to prepare them to do the interviews and gather the information. And so, when I first experimented with that class, I thought, well, it'll never work. We'll get through 3 of these things and we'll run out of time. But I couldn't believe it. They did it. They did it. And so I was really impressed by them and their ability to do this quickly. Now, what I have up here is an example from a more typical class. This is from an English 100 class, and I can share this because this is a student and this is not the student's real name. English 100 is the one class at UNC that prepares students for the first year writing class. So it's underprepared students. And this was their final project. And they had already done research. They'd already written an annotated bibliography. They'd already written an essay. And then on Monday of this class, I showed them Adobe Spark for the first time. And so they took their work that they'd already done in conventional print format on a Monday. And by Wednesday, they produced this in Adobe Spark. And that's because Adobe Spark is so well designed and powerful. And I think maybe it's a good thought to leave you with. I asked the students in writing at the end of the class to compare this work with the conventional print-based work that they had done. And what do you think their experience was? I'll leave you with that.
Thank you, Todd Taylor, for giving us an excuse to innovate.